everybody. Today I'm going to be giving a high-level overview of how Neo4j is a great fit for identity and access management. This will be looking specifically at authorization rather than authentication. So, an overview of the agenda. We'll first start by providing a high-level definition of what identity and access management is, and introduce a simple scenario to guide through this session. As a reminder, we'll also have a quick look at what we mean by a graph database and provide the anatomy of Neo4j, which is a label property graph database. Following on from this, we will explore why Neo4j is a great fit for identity and access management, and introduce a couple of customer stories who have used Neo4j as part of their identity and access management story. And last but not least, we'll show you a few links where you can learn more about the identity and access management applications, either from brief Viewers Craft Connect videos from our clients, or get your hands on a sample in the form of a graph gist. So what is identity and access management? So using the very much agreed upon definition, it is ensuring that the right individuals have access to the right resources at the right time and for the right reasons. And for us to be able to do this, to start thinking about what our implementation is going to look like, we need to determine at least identity. So what do we mean by identity? Defining it, and start to think about the structure of the organisation we're looking to implement identity and access management. So firstly, let's have a look at identity. And here I'm going to start to introduce our high-level use case that we're going to describe during this session. And I'm going to introduce Jane Smith. And Jane Smith holds a number of identities within the organisation ABC Inc. She is business analyst for the business function customer support at ABC Inc. She is the interim head of business intelligence and reporting at ABC Inc. She is also the line manager of Joe Brown, and Joe Brown is currently working on a strictly confidential portfolio at ABC Inc. She is the employee of ABC Inc. and so forth. And some of these identities that we've covered here would traditionally fit within a hierarchy view. Some of these may be a bit harder, but let's have a look at what ABC looks like. So, indeed, it looks very much like a hierarchy. ABC Inc. has a number of divisions, and within those divisions, there are a number of business functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this view of what the business looks like, and we're going to try and map Jane and Joe to this hierarchy, so we can start to think about how we're going to approach this identity and access management challenge. So here we go. And where Jane is identified as an employee, for example, she comfortably sits in training, so wants to make training materials available to employees, or as we talked about, Jane being a business analyst for customer support, lands here. You know, these fit and look relatively straightforward. Where it starts to get a bit more complicated, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to fit this in when we think about what groups and assets we're going to grant access to for Joe and Jane, is how do we treat the different identities that they have as well? For example, the interim role of head of business intelligence reporting, or the fact that Joe is working on a strictly confidential portfolio, which has been assigned to him specifically as an employee rather than Joe Brown, the business analyst. And this starts to get quite complicated. And then we take it out even further. What about when we're looking at multi-region data concerns? So, for example, how do we ensure that Jane and Joe only have access to training materials specific to their region? And this really simple example starts to highlight some of the modern challenges facing identity and access management. For example, distributed access for on-premise and in the cloud applications. And these applications can be things that have been developed in-house from scratch. These could be custom off-the-shelf applications that have been brought in and configured. These could be software as a service applications. So you have this big range of different applications and solutions placed in different places. The other challenge as well is this decentralization of resources. So we looked at a similar example with Joe Brown and the strictly confidential portfolio, where we have situations where we'll assign resources and resource groups to specific roles. But what happens when we're assigning these to specific individuals? And also the rise of the Internet of Things and different identities that people and services assume in different contexts. So as an example, the kind of context and identity I'll have when I use my Android phone will be very different to the context I'll have around, say, my in-home device for managing heating, say a Nest, which will be quite different to, say, my Fitbit and so forth. So you start to have these different contexts and these identities, and they won't necessarily fit into traditional approaches for identity access management, which tend to feature around hierarchies. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. So how about a slightly different approach with this scenario? And what I've done here, using the information about Jane and Joe's identity, along with the organizational structure that we've laid out at the start, I've taken the subsets of the data that have been mentioned, and I've created these entities. So we've got the entities here, top entity of ABC Inc. And then in blue, we've got the entities that represent the different business functions within ABC Inc. And then here in yellow, we have the roles. So for example, here we've got all employees, and head of BI reporting inherits into all employees, as does business analyst, as does line manager. So we've got these traditional roles. We've also got the employees here in pink, and we've got the portfolio and projects here in purple and green. And what we're doing here is we're taking these entities or nodes, and I'm now starting to build a relationship, a connection between these nodes to other nodes, and describing what that relationship is like. So for example, here we're talking about the business hierarchy, to here we're talking about what the roles look like. And this is now giving us the flexibility where we can say Jane and Joe have the role of business analyst, and as they are members of business analyst, they have access to this portfolio here. They have access to all the things that all employees have access to. So all employees have access to training. We can see they've got access to multi-channel portfolio here and so forth. So we're granting them access. We're showing the description of what's going on here through the relationships of what they've got access to. And also here, we can show that I'm also taking Joe as an individual and showing that he has got access. He has this relationship with the strictly confidential portfolio. And also here with Jane, Jane has direct access to the portfolio here under the customer section. And this is something specific to Jane as an employee, not Jane, a business analyst. And what I want to call into focus here is I've provided a couple of relationship types. Now, this is just a conceptual view of how you may go about doing this. And I've talked about asset groups, and this would conceptually apply to specific documents as well. But the story stands the same. What I've done here is I've created relationship type, for example, of inherit. So for example here, Jane Smith inherits access to this portfolio and everything that comes off that portfolio. But I've also got here a no inherit. And what I'm modeling or describing here is this idea that Joe Brown in this scenario has been given access, has rights to look at the strictly confidential portfolio. But what I'm saying by doing this is that anybody who goes through Joe, so for example Jane, cannot view the things that Joe has got permissions for. So in the example here, it could be the policy of ABC Inc. that line managers have access to all of the assets and resources of their direct reports for the purposes of absence or illness. But there will be certain contexts where under no circumstances, so for example for this strictly confidential portfolio, that we want to let line managers have access via their employees. So we're going to have a quick demo exploring what's going on here. So I'm going to pop into Neo4j browser, and what we're going to do here, for example, is have a look as an example, what can all employees see? So as per our diagram, we saw that all employees should have access to training. And effectively what we're doing here is saying for this role, all employees, go down the inherits relationship type as far as you can go to the end where you got M, and then return these assets. And as we can see, they've all got access to training. So that's pretty straightforward. So how about the specific role of business analyst? So again, we've named business analyst. We're looking at what they can inherit, and then we're going to return back the assets they can attack and also the asset group. So because some were portfolios, some were projects. So we run this, and again, we can see they've got access to multi-channel, customer communications, and new onboarding. So let's start having a look at Jane and Joe. So they're both business architects, business analysts. They've both got access to the business analyst roles. But what about the other stuff? Because we know that they were also looking at other things. So let's look specifically at Jane and have a look at what portfolios does she have access to. So again, we're doing the same idea. We've got Jane, and what we're doing here is we're specifying all relationships, because remember, Jane may have some not inherent relationships to assets. But what we're doing is we're putting this second part of the query here, this filter, which is basically saying she does not have access to anything that she doesn't have no inherent relationship to. So if we run this, again, we can see, and there we go. These are the asset groups that she has got access to. These are the portfolios that she's allowed to see. So let's have a look at Joe. And again, it's the same pattern, and you can see it's exactly the same query, but we've just changed the name of the person we're looking to. Now, if we run this, we can see immediately he's got access to a strictly confidential portfolio, whereas Jane does not, even though she's line managing him, and that's what we expect. So let's say we're going through this journey and Joe's finished what he needed to do on the strictly confidential project. And because it's strictly confidential, as soon as he's finished what he needs to do, he now needs to be removed from that. And again, what this looks like is very straightforward. So again, what we're doing, we're matching the employee, we're matching the portfolio that he's got access to, and we're asking for the relationship, and then we're just going to delete that relationship. So when we rerun the query of what is Joe allowed to see with regards to portfolios, we can see he's been now removed from the strictly confidential portfolio. So what have I just shown you? I've just demonstrated how I've modelled a very simple identity and access management approach for ABC Inc. in Neo4j, where I've had the flexibility to not only associate asset and asset groups to organisational roles, but also directly link employees to specific areas too. Likewise, when Joe, for example, came to the end of what he needed to do for the strictly confidential portfolio, I've removed that relationship, and it was straightforward to do that. And this is the power of Neo4j, a property graph database. So let's just quickly look at what is the anatomy of a label property graph database. So we have this concept of nodes, so these are the entities that we were looking at, and we have this concept of the relationships between them. And as you can see here, we've got a subset of the model that we drew up. And on these nodes, we can have labels. And here we've got the label of employee on these two nodes, and here we've got the label of role. So again, very much looking at the model that we're seeing. And you can have more than one label. So when we spoke about earlier, how might we handle training materials for different regions and making sure employees were going to the right region, potentially one modelling approach we may use is, as well as employee, maybe we'll put down the region as well. So for Jane, maybe we'll do employee, and then say the other label is EMEA, and maybe for Joe it'll be employee and then the US region for him. So we can do that, and this is a really powerful concept because we can start to model multi-dimensional hierarchies, domains and so forth, and that gives us a huge amount of power when looking to model our identity and access management view. So we've talked about relationships, and relationships have a direction. So you'll always specify a direction in Neo4j when you create them. And one thing I want to touch on relationships is in Neo4j we treat these as first-class citizens. And what we mean by this is that we treat the relationships as the same amount of importance as the nodes that they connect to. And we do this by creating these joins at the time of write. So when you're putting your data into Neo4j and you create the nodes and you create the relationships, those are physically manifested, and that is across the stack. And this is really powerful because it means, because we have these connections in place, we can start to think about, rather than trying to figure out how, in this example here, Joe and Jane are related, so what connection are they connected, we can start to ask, how are they connected? And immediately we can see in this diagram that they're directly connected because Jane manages Joe, but they're also indirectly connected because they're both business analysts. And this is a really powerful concept, especially when we're thinking about identity and access management, and we're trying to see if we've inadvertently granted access to resources that people shouldn't have because we weren't aware of the inheritance down a complicated route. And yes, with direction, so you always put in direction when you create the relationship, but you don't need to use it for querying. So in some scenarios where relationships are not important, that's okay. We don't worry about the direction of the relationship. But in some examples, like the example I've provided here, when we looked at the authorization tree for ABC Inc., we do use the directions because we use this to determine inheritance of resources through staff and through roles within the organization. And last but not least, we've got properties, and you can put properties both on nodes and on relationships. So for example here, we've got two properties for both this node and this node here. So we've got name and employee ID, and these are key value pairs. And one thing to note as well is you don't have to have the same properties on all of the nodes of the same label. So for example, if Jane had a Twitter handle when we wanted to add this on here, but Joe didn't, that's okay. You can do that here, and you don't have to have Twitter : null for this, not at all. You only add it if you have it and it's relevant. And one thing to note as well is we can also put constraints in. So for example, if it was absolutely mandatory that the minimum properties you were allowed to have the employee label were name and employee ID, then we can put a constraint on that and prevent nodes from being created without those two minimum properties. And like I said as well, we can have properties on relationships, and we can use the properties on relationships for a number of things. So for example here, I've put down when this relationship came to be, but maybe from the viewpoint of identity and access management, we may want to put something like a time to live, or when should that relationship expire, and so forth. So there's a whole number of ways we can enrich this information that we have. So I think we can start to see and understand why Neo4j is a great fit for identity and access management. From a design perspective, we can create something that closely relates to the business logic we need to implement. As a result, it will be easier to align the processes around granting, modifying and retracting authorization. It also makes maintenance easier, as it's more intuitive to query and explore the data. And updating the underlying model and structure is straightforward. And touching on performance, this is a big differentiator when we think about using Neo4j for identity and access management over a traditional relational database. So if you think about traditionally, you would have a normalized view. And if we think about how we'd query about asking what the relationship is between Jane and Joe, or seeing who does Jane manage, we're potentially having to iterate through. And if we have to do a number of traversals to find out all of the accesses that are available, provided we've correctly managed to think what query we need to do this is potentially a huge number of joins, which is computationally very expensive. Whereas with Neo4j, as I mentioned before, because we treat the relationship as a first-class citizen and we put it in at the time of write, it's a very simple traversal. And not only is the performance very quick, it's also very predictable traversal speeds. So this means you get a very fast performance with this, which means you have the opportunity to provide real-time authorization capability. So there are a number of ways that Neo4j can fit into identity and access management approaches. For example, you may create a graph-based repository to store the identity and access information metadata. So effectively, we take the information we have from each of the various systems that we have on our estate, the types of groups that we have, and so forth, and build the metadata view of how they all interconnect together. And this gives us a view to check and compare what we're doing with our data. Another approach, we may choose to actually keep our physical and current access and identity information inside Neo4j. So very similar to the example we've just explored with ABC Inc. And we may use that to be the heart of our identity and access management implementation. Or another approach, what we may choose to do, is take our identity and access data into Neo4j and we use it to perform audits. So we keep our system as it is and we're using Neo4j to check to see what kind of connections we've got in and have we accidentally been granting access to systems to people who shouldn't be having that access because of complicated hierarchies. So we're going to have a brief look at a couple of customer examples where they've used Neo4j for their identity and access management implementations. So firstly, we've got a London investment bank, and they used Neo4j to not only significantly speed up how long it took to grant relevant resource access to new hires, but also, most critically as well, being able to remove access from employees who had left. And they found it was easy to fit into the organisational domain. And all of those elements that came with Neo4j made it easier to maintain the identity and access management implementation. Another example is Telenor, which is one of the top 10 telco companies in Europe, and they use Neo4j to implement their subscription services to business customers. Their original relational database solution required nightly batch processing and could take many minutes to query to determine subscription rights for their customers. And because it was an overnight batching process, they were potentially querying on stale data. So moving their subscription identity and access management implementation over to Neo4j meant not only could they now query against live data, because we're talking about the connections with the data, the easy maintainability, the fast querying ability, but because of this internal structure of Neo4j, their queries that could take minutes now are taking milliseconds, enabling real-time service subscription opportunities to their customers, which was a real game changer. So if you want to find out more about the Telenor implementation, they have spoken at Graph Connect before, and there's a fantastic YouTube video where they talk about the challenges they had with their existing solution and how they implemented Neo4j and the successes they had with it. So I would heartily recommend you have a look at that video. And another Neo4j client, Lily, have also implemented an identity and access management solution which their clients use. And again, they talk about the approaches they've used and how they've found Neo4j. So those are two fantastic videos to have a look at. If you'd like to have a go at playing with Neo4j, and specifically within the identity and access management space, there's a graph GIST you can go and have a look at. So the link is there. Please do check it out. And that will give you the data and a walkthrough of how you can implement and start to query. So again, it's a great opportunity to have a look at that. And last but not least, Graph Connect, our annual conference, talking about new features coming out of Neo4j and customer stories, and as well as training, is coming back, and it's in New York this year, and it's taking place on the 20th, which is the main conference, and the 21st, which is the training day of September. And it would be brilliant if you can make it. And again, the link is there, so please do check it out. Thank you very much for joining us on this talk about identity and access management, and I hope you have found it helpful.